Well, welcome back, everyone. Hope everybody's doing well, and good to see so many people online. We're we're a virtual full house, so this is good to see. Um, I've been joking with people recently that this is the absolute geekiest and nerdiest thing you can do on a Thursday evening, and yet you're all here. So I don't know what that says about us, but I appreciate your presence, and we will get started shortly. So before I forget, we'll do some reminders. So this Sunday at 2:30, we'll have the movie discussion. So if you check our Facebook page, you'll find links to that. And then also probably been sent out by email. But if anybody doesn't have it, we'll be happy to send that out again. And I think we'll be going on to our fourth or fifth discussion every other week. So I hope you can join us, and if you've been finding it enjoyable and educational, and we'll continue to do it and find interesting topics to watch. I think it actually, we hatched the idea during COVID, but I think it's something that is do regardless, just to give. It seems a little easier to watch at home and then discuss online. We tried doing some movies at the temple and doing the discussion, and it sometimes turned into a long day. So unfortunately, or fortunately, a lot of the Buddhist films, especially the Kukai movie, for example, is pushing 3 hours. So it can be it's a pretty long day. So most college classes aren't even that long. So we'll try to be compassionate and kind to you. And I see Jamie shared the link, so appreciate that. Thank you. And if you can join us on Sunday, that would be great. Just for, if you're wondering about the timing, Seattle Koyasan does their service at noon on Sunday. I know a lot of people take part in that, so we don't want to overlap or compete with our sister temple up the road and their events. They got on this Zoom broadcasting thing a little bit sooner than we did, and had some technology and folks there that got things set up. So we are doing complementary things. Also, just in the era of COVID, it's been very interesting. Some of the temples in Hawaii are live broadcasting their morning services on Facebook. So if you're interested, I think Meguro Sensei Lahaina Shingle Mission is still doing that. So if you're interested in seeing some of the temples that usually require you to travel to get to, that's a good way to get an inside glimpse. So that's available. I know some of the temples in Japan are doing it also. So if you do a little hunting around on Facebook, there's actually now, I think, quite a bit of shingle material out there that wasn't out there before. So that's been one of the interesting things. So as I've been chatting, more people are joining. So wow, we're overflowing tonight. Thank you. So before I get started, are there any questions that came up about last time's class, or just questions in general? My excuse to sip water. Yes, Jamie posted the link to, she shared the link for Koyasan's, Seattle Koyasan service. So they usually end around 1:30. So we decided to start at 2:30 just to give people time in between if they're participating in both. So, okay. So seeing no questions, we will jump in. So first, I just hope everyone's doing really well. Sadly, when I thought or was hoping that as a nation we were coming out of COVID and doing better, a lot of states are shutting back down. So I hope, I know we've got people from at least 5 states that I know of, and different parts of the country. So wherever you are, I hope you're doing well and staying safe. I have an inside glimpse from medical professionals personally, and things really are not getting better. So as much fatigue that we might have over all of this, I hope we're still taking it very seriously and being careful, wearing masks, and maintaining the distancing and those guidelines. That's still really necessary. Here in Oregon, our cases are going up. Thankfully, not like a lot of other states, but we're all in this together. And in an era of globalized travel, it doesn't really matter where these things are. We're all affected. So sadly, this is claiming more lives this year than past wars and many other natural disasters. So we will keep all of these people in our thoughts and make that part of our practice also. So we'll continue now with the Awakening of Faith. So I will share the page just so that we know where we are. So if you have the PDF, it's page 42 of the printed page of the PDF and page 76 of 148 of the actual PDF file, if that makes sense. So whichever helps. So when I'm reading off the page, I'm using the page number printed there on the page. So this is where we left off here. So this is section B, the general coordinating causes. And since this there's these multiple bullet points, I wanted to just remind us kind of where we are. So we started off in this section, the permeation of suchness. So as I reminded people before, permeation sometimes is translated as perfuming. It just depends on the translator. And this is under section 2, permeation through influences. Last time we did section A, the specific coordinating causes, and now we're moving on to the general coordinating causes. So I actually made an outline. If people are interested, I can share it. It's sometimes helpful, I think, to go through and remember where we are, but this is where we are now. So the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas all desire to liberate all human beings, spontaneously permeating them with their spiritual influences and never forsaking them. Through the power of wisdom that is one with suchness, they manifest activities in response to the needs of human beings as they see and hear them. Because of this indiscriminately permeating cause, human beings are all equally able, by means of concentration or samadhi, to see the Buddhas. So this is where we will pick up. I would like to say that this section is self-explanatory, but I want to make a few observations. If you've ever done translation work, it's incredibly difficult. It transcends speaking a foreign language. It requires a much deeper understanding of linguistics and history, and having a pretty good understanding of both cultures, so that you're choosing words not only that take into consideration the meaning of a text, but also don't give a negative connotation to the reader in the new language that you're translating into. And I say that because we come upon this section here, and I think there's potential for confusion. So the text starts out with Buddhas and Bodhisattvas all desire to liberate human beings. So I want to point out that this is not a desire. So we run out of terms to translate in or use in English, I think, coming from Sanskrit and Chinese. And in terms of readability, desire is helpful in terms of a philosophical or religious text where we discuss desire oftentimes as something that's an obstacle. It strikes me as potentially being confusing. How do we differentiate these different desires? I want to point out that this is not a desire, rather it's probably better understood as a culmination of the Bodhisattva vow. So having recognized that all sentient beings suffer, all sentient beings share the same experience, they all experience things in the same way, and also experience things the same way that the Bodhisattva did. That realization causes compassion to well up inside of them, and that results from a deep realization that sort of, maybe we could say, propels the Bodhisattva to assist sentient beings. So it's not a desire. Bodhisattvas aren't sitting around in the Bodhisattva lounge saying, "Oh, I really want to figure out how to help people," and they're not fretting about it. They're not confronting the need for help in the same way that we do. They are. It's much more of a natural outcome of this realization. So the compassion that results from this deep realization is something more selfless rather than a selfish desire. So this is what's really being discussed in this beginning portion, is the Bodhisattva vow. So I think it's helpful to kind of parse that out a little bit before we go further. So I'll put the text back up so you can read along. And just as a side note, I think the same thing comes up when in other religions, the big three. So if you haven't heard me make this joke before, I'm from Michigan, so GM, Chrysler, and Ford, the big three, and then Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are kind of the big three religions. I know at least one person on the call would know, other than me, the big three in the pizza world, but I'll leave that joke aside. So those religions often have the problem with the use of love. They'll talk about God's love and people's love for one another, and that often gets confusing when we talk about romantic love and things like that. So I think this idea of a desire to help and a kind of selfless or more universal love have a similar translation difficulty. Okay. So the text goes on, through the power of the wisdom that is one with suchness, they manifest activities in response to the needs of human beings as they see and hear them. So I mentioned earlier, this is discussing the Bodhisattva vow, and it's a vow to save sentient beings in that they've aroused or brought forth or given rise to this universal compassion that does not make distinctions. And this is a kind of a key feature for this type of compassion. It doesn't play favorites. It doesn't see differentiating factors between people. In fact, it doesn't even distinguish people from non-people. Buddhist texts are clear to use sentient beings. And this is a compassion that is far beyond what we generally experience or practice in our day-to-day lives. But it's an ideal that we are encouraged to cultivate and a vow that we're encouraged to embrace. For me personally, this was something I found very striking, different about Buddhism from other philosophical or religious paths. It was a very radical notion of compassion, and I appreciated that there existed somewhere within our kind of collective human knowledge and consciousness something that transcended, as human beings, we can be very petty, we can be very tribal, and here was something that didn't sort of fall into that same kind of language use. So that's something that drew me to Buddhism early. So this is a kind of mind that is being discussed, the Bodhisattva's mind, that can naturally accord with any sentient being that it comes into contact with. So whenever it sees a need, it sort of naturally reflects a response in response to the need. So what Buddhas and Bodhisattvas can do, which is different from us, and based on their vow, it's combined with this idea of perfuming or permeating idea, is that they're naturally able to assist us in ways that are beneficial to us. So this is different from our experience. They have an insight that comes from what the text here is calling suchness, permeating samsara. So based on their deep wisdom, their deep insight, and being right in samsara with us, being kind of lockstep with our experience, they are able to develop a type of insight or clarity that we could say maybe wells up naturally. So with such deep compassion, they function in a way that naturally responds to people's needs. This is sort of, maybe we would say naturally, if you see a baby animal, right, your natural inclination is to say, oh, how cute. And you feel a certain, you soften. Everyone sees baby animals and reacts in a certain way. Or maybe that's just me. I'm the big softie that reacts a certain way around baby animals. But this is a natural reaction. All baby things are cute and elicit a response from other people. So this is just kind of this natural response. So this is the way bodhisattvas perceive and respond to things that come to them. And the text tells us that because they have this wisdom, they're in touch with their Buddha nature, they have this superpower, right? This is maybe we can say the superpower that comes with touching or understanding or seeing your Buddha nature. And due to this permeation, due to the fact that this wisdom is allowed to perfuse them more equally than it does us, that if we concentrate on this idea during meditation, then we can see the Buddhas. So this is the next stage of the text. I'll put that back up. So the text goes on, because of this indiscriminately permeating cause, human beings are all equally able, by means of concentration or samadhi, to see the Buddhas. So how do we see the Buddhas in this context? And I think this is it's a fairly short passage, but I think there's some really important parts here. If we can eradicate distinctions in our mind, and the distinctions here between this and that, subject to object, other people versus ourselves, people who are in foreign countries versus people here, people in another city, our people, all these different distinctions that we make, then we can see with the same mind as the Buddhas. This is the mind they have. That's very difficult for us. This is our key stopping point all the time. We're always making distinctions. It's built into our language. This is something that Kukai makes a lot of observations about, that how our language is structured structures our thinking. And it's not something you really think about unless you learn a foreign language. You have to sort of wrap your mind around a new way of thinking when you learn a language. It's not just a word for word substitution. There's a new type of thought process that happens. So, but if we can eradicate these distinctions, then we can see the Buddha, meaning we can see the Buddha in ourselves. We are then synonymous with all other Buddhas. When our mind is filled with this kind of compassion, we reflect the minds of sentient beings and Buddhas. We are synonymous with other Buddhas, and our mind, to use the language of the text, permeates the minds of sentient beings. I'll try to give an example. So I think the polite word is precocious, but when I was young, I was precocious, meaning I was getting into everything and climbing trees that are way too tall for like a 5-year-old to climb, and doing all kinds of things that always made my parents wonder if I was going to break many bones. So that was me. And my dad would describe it as he would look at me and he could sort of know exactly what I was going to do. He knew I was going to grab something that was hot or dangerous, or um, I guess I was prone to leaping from the top of the stairs onto him when he least expected it. So he had a sort of sixth sense about when I was about to put myself in danger. So I think parents can do this because they've observed their children. They have a keen idea of the directions they're going to go, or the decisions and the mistakes they may make. The Buddhas are like this too. They have gone through everything a human being can go through, and they've separated out all of the missteps that they've made during that process. And so when we approach them as a bundle of problems, they're able to see very clearly. And they have this very keen insight and awareness that we don't have yet. I talked to a addiction counselor once, and the addiction counselor was talking about how important it was for those counselors to actually have been addicts, because otherwise no one else would really understand all the tricks, all the lies, all of the the ways, the signs of abuse and addiction. And likewise, the people being counseled often said, if the person that they were getting advice from hadn't been through a similar experience, they wouldn't respect that person. So I really think the text here is saying, the Buddhas have walked every mean street in the world. They've been through every dramatic situation, and whatever we walk in the door with, they can see right through it. There's nothing that we can do to hide. But they're not to scold us. They're there to help us. And then likewise, through meditation practice, through samadhi, right, through calming the mind, then we can get the same sort of insight. And when we get that insight, we are seeing the Buddha. We're seeing the Buddha inside ourselves. We're seeing all of the Buddhas, because their enlightenment is equal. What differentiates Buddhas, if they have an equal enlightenment, what differentiates them is their initial vow. What triggered them to make the change? So you can see this with regard to the Buddha's various vows, their name, how their Pure Land is described. So something triggered them to say, I want to fix this issue. This is the thing that's triggered me to start the path of awakening. And that's the only thing that differentiates them, right? Kind of what put them on the path. I think there's also a deeper cosmological idea here also. And the text says, by means of this concentration, sentient beings are able to see the Buddhas. It doesn't say see the Buddha singular, but plural. And as I was reading this, I was reminded of the idea of Indra's net. So this shows up in Vedic literature, but also in the Avatamsaka Sutra. And book 30 of the Avatamsaka Sutra is named the Incalculable. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Because it focuses on the idea of infinity and the idea that the activity of enlightenment is in all the details, all the knowledge, all the activities of the universe, that it's completely infinite. Maybe I was also thinking of this because we're currently being visited by a visitor from the far reaches of our galaxy, a comet. So I encourage you all to look up to the night sky and do a short meditation on how vast this universe is. But this book 30 of the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Incalculable, the idea is that world systems are exhaustive, the knowledge of the Buddhas are exhaustive, and I think the text here is hinting that in deep meditation, we're capable of opening our minds to this exhaustive, infinite potential. It's only a few words, but there's a lot there. And part of what I want to do is not that my goal isn't that you'll come away as a master of every Buddhist text that we touch, but more begin the appreciation for the depth of wisdom that's contained therein. And over time, you get to see these connections between different texts, and it's always something I find interesting. So, yes, with meditation and samadhi, you'll begin to see the Buddhas. So we'll go on to the next section, which is one of my favorites. I'll put this up so you can see it. The translator's note. So, as I said, welcome fellow travelers on the Buddhist Nerd Zoom broadcast here. So the translator's note is, the wisdom that is one with suchness, because of the comments of Fazang and others, are too brief and vague at this point. The translation follows the interpretation of the Chinese monk Zishuan, who dates back to the year 1038. He says, in essence, the wisdom, or this wisdom, is the same as suchness, and also that this wisdom enables one to know that all profane, meaning ordinary people, and sacred, enlightened people, defiled and pure, are equally one in what is real. This permeation through the influences of the wisdom whose essence is one with suchness is also divided into two categories according to the types of recipients. So I think that these ancient commentators are actually really helpful because they've done a lot of this thinking about the text and what it means for us. And this is a fairly, in my opinion, realized commentator, in that momentarily we need to make the distinction between, in order for us to start the path, we have to make the distinction between sacred and profane, or pure and impure, or helpful or non-helpful practices. But ultimately, what the teaching is saying is it's all part of the same continuum. It's all part of the same universe. It's all, it all has a place. We just need to know for our current situation what's beneficial for us. But at the stage of enlightenment, there's nothing to be gotten rid of. There's no reason to see these things separate any longer. I'll never forget my teacher was explaining this. This was quite a number of years ago now, but he was giving the example of, if there was dog poop in the street and you had to clean it up, he said, the mind is the problem. That if you had nothing to pick it up with but your hand, you'd pick it up and throw it away, and then you'd wash your hand and you'd keep your hand. But if you had to use your handkerchief, you probably would throw the handkerchief away as well. That you would never probably find the handkerchief clean enough to use again to wipe your face. But the handkerchief would be clean after it's washed, but your mind would make a distinction. So the problem of us making these distinctions continues on until we are enlightened. So it's something to be aware of, but in an ultimate sense, there are no distinctions, right? There's no difference. So put the text back up and continue. So this permeation through the influence of the wisdom whose essence is one with suchness is also divided into two categories according to the types of recipients. This is a introductory language to another set of categories that are about to be introduced by Asavagosha. And those categories are going to utilize language that probably needs a little bit more explanation. So if you look down to the next section, The one is yet to be united with suchness. Ordinary people, the Hinayanists, and those bodhisattvas who have just been initiated devote themselves to religious practice on the strength of their faith, being permeated by suchness through their mind and consciousness. Not having obtained the indiscriminate mind, however, they are yet to be united with the essence of suchness, and not having obtained the perfection of this discipline of free acts, they are yet to be united with the influence of suchness. So here's another place where it bears reminding. When we see this Hinayanist, this is not, we're not talking about different schools of Buddhism, as the term is sometimes used in translation or in modern texts or in philosophical texts where there's a distinction between Mahayana and Hinayana. So we're not discussing the Theravada or those schools that are predominant in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. This is actually discussing a philosophical viewpoint that existed during Asvaghosha's time, not so much today, but in the context of the Indian philosophical landscape. So it's not a slur of the Theravada schools. So this is something I've always want to point out when we're seeing Hinayanists from a text of this vintage. What he is talking about, or what he's discussing here, are that those that are practicing who have not yet experienced thusness, the people, you've been meditating, you've been doing some practice, you don't think you've made a breakthrough, you don't feel you've awakened the bodhisattva vow yet, you feel maybe very overwhelmed by it all, that the bodhisattva vow thing sounds good, but in being honest with yourself, you find that's a pretty big challenge. Maybe there's other more immediate concerns, which is natural. I think most people who are starting off are still struggling with relaxation. We're still struggling with finding the mind not jumping around so much. And as I often say, no one comes into the temple with palms together saying, I want to perfect the bodhisattva vow. Most people start off with, I really want to reduce stress. My job is killing me. My all the different obligations in life are becoming too much. I'm overwhelmed. I need to slow down. So we start with a personal perspective. This is true of the Buddha as well. However you want to slice it, he had a personal shock of leaving the palace and seeing old age, sickness, and death, and realizing that his life was, he's living a lie. And this starts his journey. So that was his trigger initially. Of course, he progressed to being the Buddha, but the starting point for all of us is different. So this is discussing our current philosophical starting point. I think this is important because first, the text is giving us an outline of all the different situations that we find ourselves in and providing a framework for us to understand. And then it's going to go and talk at where we're going to find ourselves at different levels and different stages of the path. So those who are pervaded, so to speak, by the bodhisattva vow, and those with work to do, right? I have work to do. Am I trying to do or perfect the bodhisattva vow? Absolutely. Like anyone, you turn on the news and find something that tests that resolve? Absolutely. So what we're doing here is trying to gauge the perspective, get perspective on the pitfalls and the full journey. It's not, Asvaghosha's role here is not to sugarcoat or make the path sound simple. He's trying to give us a very clear guidance on whether our practice is weak and why. Are we doing the right practice for ourselves? If not, should we switch or should we spend more time with it? Is progress something that we're going to see after additional practice? Should we change course? we all ask these kind of questions. We all feel that we may be stuck in a rut. Who doesn't feel that they're not making progress, or they should be making progress faster? We have this feeling with regard to education, with regard to our career. We compare ourselves to other people. We compare relationship progress. Do we have one? Should we have one at our age? Should we be at a different stage in relationship? All these things come up. So if we think that way with regard to life, of course, we're going to think that way with regard to spiritual practice. And also Gosha is providing this framework of where people find themselves. He's going to give us three general categories of where we find ourselves so that we can make adjustments. So as he goes on, think of this as a fine adjustment guide. If you're old enough to remember VHS, this is the tracking button. Right? You have to dial it in just right so it's clear on your screen. You've got everything situated correctly, but there's still fine adjustments that need to be made. So this is the key. And one of the keys that he points out is they're going to progress based on their faith. So at some time, we may have a lot of doubts, but we keep going, or we propel ourselves forward based on the strength of our faith. And he's just saying it's natural to find yourself in that position. So that's his thesis at this point. So we will skip down, and we come to another translator's note. And you know I love these, so I will read you this one also. So Fazang identifies the perfection of the discipline of free acts with the knowledge that emerges after enlightenment and which functions spontaneously, adapting itself to all circumstances in the world. Okay, what does that mean? It's another glimpse into the enlightened mind. When we are able to free our mind of distinctions, we gain something new. So first, generally, we think of, when I use the word gain, we think of gain as obtaining, accumulating, but Buddhism's really oriented around losing, and I'll explain what that means. So this doesn't initially resonate with us, especially in the West. Our culture is about material gain, accumulation. We think of losing, loss, reduction in a pejorative manner. We kind of recoil from the idea of loss. But Buddhism says it's all of the accumulation is really our problem. To quote the prophet of Harlem, more money, more problems. So when we lose our preconceptions, when we lose our agitation, when we lose our fear, when we lose our preconceived notions, then we gain something new. But the gain is freedom, it's liberation, it's that we haven't been able to see clearly before how it was that these accumulations weighed us down. So what is gained, quote unquote? What do we gain? And Fazang here is commenting about this idea of gain. And Fazang is one of the great commenters on the awakening of faith. And he's commenting on what the text calls knowledge that emerges after enlightenment and which functions spontaneously, adapting itself to all circumstances in the world. So, throw that back up in case you don't have the text in front of you. So this is his comment. So rather than struggle as we do at times to help others, to understand others, that's a very human, natural struggle. Instead, with insight from the Bodhisattva's perspective, it becomes effortless. So if we look at the sutras, I think we can see that the way the Buddha answers people, the way questions are sometimes not answered, shows how effortless this becomes. The Buddha doesn't say, "Oh, wow, that's a good question. Let me let me get back to you. Let me think about that one. The answers are effortless. So this is a difference between how we approach situations versus the bodhisattva. I want to take a moment to point out who is Fazang. So Fazang is a great Buddhist monk who lived during the Tang Dynasty. He died in about 712. He is responsible for starting the what in Japanese is called Tendai or Tiantai. He's one of the great patriarchs of the Tiantai school. And he would have died not that much before Kobodaishi entered China. And he wrote commentaries on just a tremendous number of texts on meditation, texts clarifying ideas that are in the sutras. And he wrote a fantastic commentary on the awakening of faith. So when you see his name throughout as part of these translators' notes, it's the translator kind of telling us that he's relying on Fazang scholarship. So here we are reading a text from the 400s with a great commentary written in the late 600s, early 700s, and translated in the 60s. And here we are in 2020. So it's really, thank you for the journey through history, for being here. So I mentioned Fazang because in terms of East Asian Buddhist schools, he's a tremendous scholar. So if you're interested, maybe one day we can actually do a series on some of the great monks and nuns in Buddhist history. Their lives are really fascinating. Some of the things that they had to go through are just really heroic, tremendously inspiring stories. And sometimes when I personally think of difficulties that I may have, if I reflect on their life stories, I just have to laugh and wonder why I'm getting down on myself or something when, by comparison, you really can't compare some of the challenges that they faced. So, okay, that's my aside. So, another sip of water because it's warm, and we'll continue. Okay, so that was the first category. So next comes the second. So the other is the already united with suchness. Bodhisattvas who realize the Dharmakaya have attained undiscriminating mind and are united with the essence of the Buddhas. They, having obtained free acts, are united with the influence of the wisdom of the Buddhas. They singly devote themselves with the spontaneity of their religious disciplines on the strength of suchness within, permeating into suchness so that suchness will reclaim itself, then destroy ignorance. So the text here tells us about another type of mind, the type already associated with deep practice and attainment, a mind that's permeated or perfumed with suchness. And what Asvagosha is talking about are bodhisattvas. They are firmly on the path. Perhaps we can say that they're like pro athletes. They are still practicing. They are performing at an incredibly high level. They need to fine-tune their technique or adapt to new players, something along this line. But they are already very high, at a very high level. And here we have the idea that the bodhisattva's deep practice permeates into their Buddha mind. So it's probably much more clear to them than it is for us, but it still maybe has a slightly obscured. Maybe there's just one more curtain they need to pull aside before complete realization. And they're moving from a stage of practice. As a bodhisattva, you're moving from a stage of practice that creates merit for you, or that where you're looking for tangible benefit, to a stage where you're working to extinguish the last vestiges of delusion. You're banishing that last shadow of the mind's understanding of the teaching. You're not struggling with the basics. We're struggling with the basics. We're struggling sometimes with, that was a good meditation I had 4 weeks ago, but the last few weeks my legs hurt, and that's all I can think about. So maybe you can say that the Bodhisattva is the NBA player that scores 40 points a game, and he has moved out of the idea of, will he win or lose, and he's perfecting the timing of when the ball leaves his hand, or spinning between the opposing players. There's very, very much a fine tuning of an understanding, or a much more deeper appreciation of the game. So there's a slightly different perspective. We're sitting in the same hall practicing, we're reciting the same sutras, but what part of themselves are polishing may be different from what we're doing. Maybe I can liken this to a novelist. And here's a novelist who is published, and their stories grab you because, unbeknownst to us, they have written just tremendously detailed backstories for all the characters. All kinds of detail that never makes it into the book, but it comes through in the little details that are mentioned in the novel. The choice of fabric of what the character is wearing, or a particular word choice or word ordering that communicates to the reader that there is a deep backstory, that the author has thought about this backstory and really created this character. So it's a fine-grained detail is what the Bodhisattva is working on that differentiates where we are in practice. So again, what Asagosha here is doing is providing a framework for us to understand where we find ourselves, where we will find ourselves when we've perfected the Bodhisattva vow and have moved on further in our practice. So we'll go down a little bit further. Again, the defiled principle, Dharma. So notice it's a lowercase d, Dharma. So when we're referring to the Buddha's teaching, it's usually a uppercase D, Dharma, Buddha Dharma. So again, the defiled principle, or Dharma, from the beginningless beginning, continues perpetually to permeate until it perishes by the attainment of Buddhahood. But the permeation of the pure principle has no interruption and no ending. The reason is that the principle of suchness is always permeating. Therefore, when the deluded mind ceases to be, the Dharmakaya, suchness, original enlightenment, will be manifested and will give rise to the permeation of the influence of suchness, and thus there will be no ending to it. So as I mentioned earlier, maybe it's the comet visiting our corner of the solar system that had me reflecting on this way, but I read this as both a commentary on the nature of our minds as well as a cosmological statement of the highest order. So I'll try to explain what I mean by that. What is the drama that we're engaged in that we call life? Right? What is this thing? Here, Asagosha tries to refer to it as a process, and it's a process from the Buddhist perspective is the defiled principle, right? The way let's back up real quick. The defiled principle, Dharma, from the beginningless beginning continues perpetually to permeate until it perishes by the attainment of Buddhahood. So he's talking here about beginningless beginning continues to permeate. So he's first setting up a timeline. And the timeline here transcends our momentary experience with the label that we've all grown up thinking defines us. Right? We're all given a name by our parents. We think that this orients us into the world, and he's poking holes in that idea. The idea that this is a very rigid or straight timeline. And then next, there's what we read as a definitive statement of the trajectory of life. That we are permeated with ignorance until it perishes finally with enlightenment. So these two perspectives are here. So what he's doing is giving us insight into our nature, as well as the triumph of the Buddha, or the triumph the Buddha had under the Bodhi tree. Throughout countless lives, throughout our life, we share a particular view of what it means to be alive, what it is we're doing here. And this idea should set out a map for ourselves. So Oswegoshi's words should sort of create a map. It should reassure us and bind us together in the knowledge that we all share in the same experience. We all, we should be asking what really makes us different. There are countless little things, but what Oswegoshi is saying is these countless little things grow out of the same source, ignorance. And then on the flip side, how do we actually develop compassion? So the various symptoms that we see stem from the same illness. Whatever it is that we're struggling with has the same root cause. So to give you an example, our current national struggle with COVID, for some is relatively minor. Some don't even know they're sick, they have no symptoms. For others, it's a very severe illness, and others succumb to the illness. So there's no one way that this virus manifests. And if you think about the current wider awareness of the impact of bias, racial inequality, racism, and social justice movements that we're seeing in the country, these actions also stem from a deep ignorance. The symptoms, however, are quite real. We have to take provisional steps to address them, but ultimately one person's experience of inequality is linked with the person or system that exerts the oppression. Violence is being done on both sides. What isn't recognized is that it's due to ignorance permeating the mind. So what does this mean for the development of compassion? So Oswegoshi is kind of challenging us here. So do we say we have this compassion and do nothing? So we're very passive as Buddhists. We're like, oh no, we're compassionate, so we don't get involved in these ideas or debates. No, but we have to reflect on whether our response creates more or less compassion for us. Does it create more or less ignorance? Does it create more or less sadness? So if we pause and generate compassion for the person assailing us with hate, then do we have a different perspective? If we pause when confronting individuals who want to reject basic science about public health, can we generate compassion for them and then formulate a response that doesn't push them away? Can we formulate a response, create a space, generate a space where they can actually hear a different perspective? So this is, the perspective of bringing compassion into these very difficult situations. So I think if we don't do that, we do damage to ourselves. If we don't do that, we're digging ourselves deeper into the permeation of ignorance, as the text would call it. The question I get often these days is, how do I know I'm doing it the right way? What's the guide? And other than the person confronting you directly, and in the moment, that's a split-second decision. But most of these situations, when we're talking about, local, state, national responses to some of these issues, it would behoove us to pause and reflect and make sure that we have a full understanding. So I think, again, first, it's not simple, but also, are we doing it selfishly or selflessly, right? Do we have the idea of including everyone in our solution, or are we still making distinctions? So here in Portland, we've had daily demonstrations around social justice issues, and there's a lot of slogans in town. I had to look a lot of them up. I wasn't familiar with the acronyms for certain things. But one thing that I've noticed is there's a lot of us versus them kind of rhetoric happening. And I actually went downtown to where the demonstrations were, and I talked to some of the people who were demonstrating, and then I also went and talked to some of the police. And one of the police officers I spoke with, we were socially distanced when we had the conversation. One of the police officers I talked to said, he said, you know, you have our attention. We're listening. We want to change. And his partner, I think, had a different perspective and didn't say very much, but I could tell he felt attacked. He was taking it personally. So I think when we talk about bringing compassion into real life, day-to-day confrontations, we have to be honest. We have to know how we got here, but we also have to be conscious and aware of whether or not our response is creating more separation in the process. Of course, everyone's responsible for their own reactions to things, but there is a way to go about some of this dialogue that is not disingenuous to a cause for making things better, but also it has a greater chance of bringing people together, and again, does less damage to all of us. So that's our practical application of the text today. So, we're going to go forward a little bit more. And of course, we run up against the translator's note. There's a lot of these in this section, so I apologize. So we're going to get close to wrapping up for tonight, because there is a lot of, it gets a little bit in the weeds here in terms of terminology and philosophical language, but we'll keep going here. So the translator's note, that is to say, ignorance has no beginning, but does have an ending. While original enlightenment or suchness has neither beginning nor ending, it is evident that the nature of ignorance is not ontological, but is epistemological. If it were ontological, if it were ontological and were conceived as being, this conclusion that ignorance has no beginning but has an ending would be absurd. So I apologize. We've entered Philosophy 101 course with the translator's note. So I'll try to come up with a simplified way of explaining kind of what we're dealing with and why this comes up here. Ontology is a study of what is, whether or not we exist, whether or not things actually exist, whether there's a Buddha, and in this example, whether or not this enlightened mind, this suchness underlying our minds as we know them sitting right here and now, whether there's actually this suchness existing in this mind also. And the study of how the two, our mind and the enlightened mind, are connected, intertwined, and how they permeate one another. This is maybe the ontological question. And how do we answer this question? Practically speaking, there's really no logical way to answer this. I can't come up with a word puzzle that proves that there is Buddha nature. I can't come up with a proof that shows this. And that's why it's spoken of in Buddhist texts in terms of metaphor. It's discussed in terms of poetry, right? The moon reflected in the water. It gives us a sense of the concept, but it doesn't answer the question definitively. So the translator notes saying, rather, the commentary here is epistemological. So we're dealing with knowledge, things that have cognitive success, things we can agree on. And we can agree on the problem. So this is why Buddhism discusses a lot the obstacles that we suffer in life, the way they manifest, and many of the ways that we kind of get ourselves deeper into the mud, so to speak. So those are things, right? Just right here, right now, we can see the monkey mind. We can observe ourselves having difficulty with meditation. So the Buddhist texts are filled with this. This we can agree on. The idea being that with more understanding of that process, the more we see that clearly, by seeing that process, we can see the enlightened mind underlying it. Because as we stop that process from replicating, as we stop responding in the same way habitually, then we can actually see that there's another mind underlying this mind that we live with day to day. So if I were to just tell you there is this ignorant mind and there's this enlightened mind, you would say, show me, right? Prove it. And so there's no smooth method that I can produce these two minds on a table for you to compare side by side and to be inspected. But we can compare and contrast the wisdom in the sutras with our own perspective. We can perhaps observe, oh, this isn't immediately evident to me, but I can infer from the underlying differences between these two perspectives that there's a greater wisdom. So this is the perspective taken in the awakening of faith. So this is what the text is talking about here. So before we go on, I just want to move on to the next section and introduce it. But before we go further, are there any questions? I'll take a sip of water while I give everyone a chance to think about it. Okay. So normally we would come to this section and I would pause, but I want to introduce the next section because I think it sort of sums up where we've been and how we got here. So maybe that'll be evident from the text. So I'll put that back up screen, and then there will be a quiz, so pay attention. Okay. So the essence itself and the attributes of suchness, or the meanings of Maha. So it starts out with this first short section, and we're only going to read this section. And I'll explain kind of why I think this is important. So the essence of suchness knows no increase or decrease in ordinary people, the Hinianists, the Bodhisattvas, or the Buddhas. It was not brought into existence in the beginning, nor will it cease to be at the end of time. It is eternal through and through. Okay. Very short, but I think it's very important. Throughout the text, we've discussed the idea of pure and impure states of mind. And we've said, the text has told us that these states of mind are permeated by ignorance, and that those permeated by suchness, right, those of the Buddha nature, are kind of in the other spectrum. So this section is distinguishing how the two intertwined natures are similar and how they're different. So how is it that we have both existing at the same time, this Buddha nature and ignorance at the same time? It's actually very important from the perspective of Buddhist philosophy to clarify this, I think, as a whole philosophical system. So in order for the arguments or the system that Buddhism lays out, I think this part is important. So I'll try to explain this a little bit. So I'll throw this back up on screen so you can follow along, even though it's a short, really short section. Put that right there. So it starts off the idea that impure dharmas oppose pure dharmas. So what it's saying is those practices that are not helpful for our development, our spiritual development, are in opposition to those practices that are helpful to our spiritual development. So they work in opposition to one another. So it's not to say that they're consciously undermining you, right? So if you, I don't know, if you do something that is classically, if you steal, it's not that theft is hiding in a corner trying to undermine you. Rather, we have to understand that it's maybe more like a computer virus. So the computer virus slows your computer down. It makes it function improperly. It wreaks havoc on your system, and it causes you all sorts of headaches. So this is an impure dharma. It's not. It's not hiding, waiting for you to make a misstep and then to kind of grab you, and it's not conscious. Put it that way. So that's the first point. So impure dharmas oppose pure dharmas. The second point, the text tells us that these impure dharmas, and here dharma lowercase d, so these laws, functions, or attributes are beginningless. So in my example, the computer virus is lurking behind every web page. Anything we download might have a virus. So we have to be careful at all times. But we can eradicate viruses from our computer, and it is possible to keep the computer virus free. So impure dharmas as a category of things are beginningless. Right? They have no beginning. You can't find an initial starting point for these things. So then the text tells us third, by comparison, pure dharmas, so those laws, functions, practices, etc., that support bringing out your Buddha nature, these things do have a beginning, and they're endless. So in my example, once you have a properly functioning antivirus software and you keep it updated, your computer runs smoothly and you don't have interruptions in your work and you're not disturbed, right? So the text is, on the one hand, impure dharmas are beginningless. Pure dharmas have a beginning, but impure dharmas will come to an end and pure dharmas will continue forever. So there's an overlap, right? Impure dharmas come in at some point, pure dharmas arise, and then impure dharmas cease and pure dharmas continue. So here's the quiz. Are you ready? Why do you think this is? Why would pure practices have a beginning but be endless? Does anyone want to try? Any ideas? I know you're all thinking it's far too late. I can't think that hard. I need more coffee. Okay, I'll answer the question for you. So to restate, why would pure practices have a beginning but be endless? Once pure practices are established, they supplant other practices. So the prior impure dharmas were the result of us not being vigilant. Once we begin this process of being vigilant, right, once you start on the spiritual path, there's a point at which the bodhisattva no longer backslides, right? Your practice is, you're fully cemented in it. And as long as you practice it, you're constantly eradicating the impure dharmas. And then that becomes who you become. Those are the practices that support you. So you clear out all the dust, you clean out your spiritual attic, so to speak. And then once it's clear, you're not going to fill it back up because you've come to the realization of how it got there in the first place. Once you, in my example, if you're old enough, you remember when everyone's computer had a computer virus and it just slowed down and you just had to live with it. And then you get the antivirus software and you're like, oh, this is the way it should be. And then you now know this is what I need for proper functioning. I'm not going back to the prior existence of winging it and hoping for the best and hoping I don't get a virus. It's too important. So likewise, with the arising of these practices, you recognize something new within yourself, and you don't want to go back to the impure state. You don't want to go back to a point where um, you're practicing in a way that undermines your happiness, that undermines the stability of your mind. And yes, one of the recommendations here answers the question: does it have to do with the vow to help all living beings? It does. If you have this deep insight um, into that everyone is hurting in the same way that you hurt, that everyone struggles in the same way, that everybody feels love and loss in the same way. You're going to be far more careful in your words. You're going to be far more careful in the way you regard other people. If you have had the experience where, maybe you were deeply hurt by someone, you may think, oh, I would never do something like that. I would never say or act in that way to cause harm in that manner. So in this way, the pure dharmas supplant the impure dharmas, right? So these are on the ascendancy, and at some point it becomes too much for us, and then these pure practices come in and take over, and we leave this behind. So these things are beginningless, because without practice, without doing something to check ourselves or to put restraints on sort of this, I do whatever I want and no one tells me kind of cavalier attitude, then it goes on. But once you see the impact and it becomes clear, then you leave that behind. So I think this is important because it's sort of a deep philosophical insight. Is also, again, hopeful language. So if you go back to the earlier ontologies and epistemological knowledge, I can't, open up somewhere and show you, oh, here's my Buddha mind, and here's, my current mind, and, see how much more dust is on this one and, than this one. We can't have a proof like that in the same way that a lot of scientific knowledge or scientific proofs come about, where it's something you can observe. So it doesn't lend itself to this type of observation. So it's something that we have to reason through and do some practice. And once you gain that perspective, once you maybe see through that a little bit more deeply, then you don't want to go back to the way things were. You may say, I'll do anything to avoid that. I definitely don't want to go back to that situation. This comes up with a lot of things. I was actually talking to someone the other day about graduate education and why it's formulated the way it is. And in large part, it's not the best way to educate, but it's the way the educators were educated, and that's what they know. So they perpetuate something that doesn't work very well, but it's comfortable for them, or they perpetuate something that is not the best method, but is it's what they know. Or it becomes more sadistic. Well, I did it that way and it was horrible, so everyone else has to do it that way also. So there's a better way to do it, but it requires some triggering insight. So this is, as we go further in the text, this is what Ashokosh is trying to teach us. I hope that's helpful. Actually, this is a kind of a important part of the ideas about the spiritual path, and they're laid out in a kind of a dry way, because this is almost like an outline or a handbook to it's not about a particular talk the Buddha gave. It's not let's illustrate a story. We don't have the Buddha came upon the difficult man on the roadside, and they had this conversation. The awakening of faith is Asavagosha's attempt to lay out the entirety of the path as an outline so that we know stages that we're going through in general, these big generalities, and then to point us. So the later part of the text has to do with practice, but then to point us into, once we have a fuller understanding of how it operates, then what practices we should do. The outline idea is really important for this reason. If you practice for a long time, you're going to begin to wonder, where do these things fit? And then maybe even more importantly, where are you in the path? And perhaps, we're always wondering where we're going, but certain questions arise at certain phases of practice. So by seeing the path laid out later on, instead of facing kind of this moment of uncertainty, you can reflect back and say, oh, right, of course, the awakening of faith was saying, I'm at this stage, and that stage is going to have these obstacles. Those are the exact obstacles I find myself with now. So I'm going to, benefit of the doubt, this is going to pass, or, things can get better. But the awakening of faith was written at a time when there was no outline to work with before that. So this becomes something that most later schools of East Asian Buddhism rely on quite heavily to formulate the thinking of what practice they're doing and why they're doing that practice, and to sort of orient themselves in regard to other teachings and other schools of Buddhism that existed at the time. For us, it's a text that Kukai recommended. It's also important from the perspective, I think, any practitioner, you're going to give this much time to something, you're eventually going to want to know, what is the, what's the roadmap? What are the obstacles between point A and point B? How does the road turn? When should I gas up? When am I going to run low on fuel? All these things are going to come up as questions. And so this text is one of those opportunities to see it all laid out as a framework. And then as you read through other texts or you hear other teachings, then you can plug them in. But there's also questions here that are answered that the Buddha didn't answer. So those kind of famous questions: what is it that you are fully enlightened to? What is it like to be a Buddha? Do all Buddhas have the same insight? Some of these things at the time, the Buddha didn't answer. And in the Lotus Sutra, you have the parable of the poison arrow, where sometimes it's natural as we as human beings inquire about things that are outside of the current need. So in the parable of the poison arrow, the Buddha said, we are prone to inquire about things that are not of immediate need. So you're shot with a poison arrow and someone runs to you and says, let me help you. And you're like, no, wait, before you help me, who shot me, and where were they exactly, and what exact kind of poison is this, and what type of bird feathers are those on the end of the arrow? And so you go through all of these kind of questions, and in the meantime you're dying. And so the Buddha was clear to say certain questions are more immediate than others. Here with Asavagosha's text, we're hundreds and hundreds of years, nearly 1,000 years after the Buddha's lifetime, and these Buddhist philosophers are answering some of these questions based on that history of practice, partially so that later philosophers running up against other cultures, running up against new ideas from around the world, have a framework from which to understand things as a whole, so that you don't run into that well, I had a really deep moment of doubt, you throw your hands up and give up. Or, as was often the case, I think, especially in ancient times, as I said before, a variety of books were not always available easily. And maybe you find yourself in the situation where I feel good about this practice, but this temple out here in the countryside of wherever, my teacher wasn't able to answer this question, so I give up. So the hope was, by writing a text like this, it was something that everyone would have available. They'd be able to read and say, this is the framework, this is the structure, this is kind of where we're going. And I understand that this practice right now is probably what I need. And later on, maybe I'll need something else. That's the time to then maybe seek out a different teacher. But this is where I am currently. So that's a lot of what we're doing with the Awakening of Faith. So as I've said, this is very, on the one hand, very, very geeky. We're very much in the philosophical weeds. You probably didn't expect you'd be running up against terms like ontology and epistemology this evening, but they are interesting from the framework of how we ask questions about spirituality and religion. And if you compare to the other types of religious discourse you'll see, I think you'll, at least I do, I have a great appreciation of how different this is, and the types of questions it's answering. And maybe you can say what really, we struggle with on a day-to-day basis. Some of these big cosmological questions aren't the questions of our day. By that, I mean our personal day. What is it that we're struggling with? I think we struggle with stress of social media, of jobs and family, but we've all asked these big questions, and the Awakening of Faith at least gives us that kind of roadmap framework for where, first, that there are answers to those questions, and that Buddhist thinkers have thought of those questions. Then we have an idea of where to go find them. So that a lot of these translators' notes are actually about where Asagosha is pulling these ideas from. So if you wanted more, you would know where to go. Are there any questions? Requests for clarification? Feel free to type in our chat box or just jump in. No? Okay. So please do, if you have time this Sunday, please join us for the movie conversation. We are, as I mentioned before at the beginning, still in the throes of COVID. So I think we're going to offer some additional practice opportunities remotely and continue to do this by Zoom, rather than put people in a position where they feel like they need to make a choice between being physically present or being present virtually. So it may just be that 2020 is the year of virtual Dharma, and that's just where we are. So if that's the case, then I personally will try to embrace that and look at it as new ways that we can share the Dharma with more people. That has been successful. I know we have lots of North America represented tonight, and I think I see someone from Canada. So hello to our friends up north. And I'm sorry we're not allowed into the country right now because America is not getting its act together. But I look forward to visiting Canada again when we can, when we're allowed. So I look forward to things. I was right. I love Toronto too. Okay, I love Toronto. Great. And then if you have other ideas, recommendations for the movie list, or other things you'd like to see, either as part of this class or a different class, I will entertain all ideas. We got here through your recommendations and ideas, and people, throwing ideas out there and suggestions. So I really do welcome that. We're going through the awakening of faith. Aswagosha definitely didn't have the internet, didn't have this camera that I'm looking at. So, but I'm fairly sure that if they had these tools, they would have used them to great effect. So I don't, we entered this brave new world of online offerings. I don't assume that we've thought of all the best ways to use it. So if you have ideas, we'll do it. And it looks like we have the ability to put the outline. Like I said, I made an outline of the text, so we'll try to put that on our website for you to reference. Sometimes it's hard to flip back and forth, or as we go through the night, to understand where we are, so we can put that online. So, all right. Well, I thank you all for being with us this evening. I can ask you to put your palms together. We will recite Kobudaishi's mantra. Namo Daishi Henjo Kongo. Namo Daishi Henjo Kongo. Namo Daishi Henjo Kongo. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's good to see everyone virtually. I've seen some of you in person. If you don't feel comfortable asking during the class, feel free to email me. There's a direct email link on the temple's webpage. I will watch for those. And if you want to chat about other things, I'm happy to try to do that as time allows also. So please stay safe. I look forward to seeing those of you who can this Sunday. And if not, then again next week. So thank you. Take care. Please, everybody, take care. Good night.